They called it a battlefield, but those who saw it with their own eyes swore it looked more like a slaughterhouse under the open sky. The summer sun of June 1876 beat down on the rolling Montana plains, but its warmth did nothing to soften the horror that lay strewn across the hills and ravines of the Little Bighorn. When the soldiers of the relief columns finally arrived, they did not find an orderly field of fallen men. They found a wasteland of mutilated corpses, stripped of their uniforms, bloated in the heat, and surrounded by a silence so heavy it seemed the land itself recoiled in grief. Some accounts said the stench carried on the wind for miles. Others could not speak of it at all. The Battle of the Little Bighorn was over, but what was left behind was not just the ruin of George Armstrong Custer and his command. It was a vision of death so grotesque, so unforgettable, that it haunted every man who dared to walk through it. Before we dive deep, please remember, your support truly keeps history alive. If you enjoy unraveling mysteries like this, I'd be grateful if you'd hit the like button, share this video with friends who love history, and drop a comment with your thoughts as we go along. Your feedback fuels new stories and debates, and I'd love to hear your take. On June 25th, 1876, 5 companies of the 7th U.S. Cavalry rode into legend under the leadership of George Armstrong Custer. None of them rode back. The combined forces of the Lakota, Northern Cheyenne, and Arapaho, led by Sitting Bull, Crazy Horse, and Gaul, met them with ferocious resistance. The battle itself lasted only hours, but the aftermath stretched on in dread for days, months, and generations. What survivors and later investigators found behind the smoke and the blood told a story of desperation, vengeance, and a cruelty that seared itself into American memory. White Wolf, a Northern Cheyenne, walked among the corpses the day after the fight and remembered the oddities as much as the horror. Young warriors and even children scavenged pockets and boots, pulling out square green paper money and laughing at its uselessness on the prairie. Some of those bills became blankets for mud toy horses. Some were kept as curiosities. Silver coins were hammered into buckles and ornaments, repurposed into trophies that would be worn back in the village. Whiskey flasks, still half full, circulated among warriors. Little Hawk and Wooden Leg both remembered the sharp, burning bite of the trooper's liquor, how the taste was laughed at, then blamed for the soldiers' erratic behavior in battle. These relics, money, buckles, bottles, tell a second story about that day, a story of what the victors took home. When cavalry columns finally reached the site on June 27th, the sight drove men to mute horror. Captain Tom Custer, George's younger brother, lay face down, his skull shattered, arrows projecting grotesquely from his back and head. One arrowhead was bent deep within bone. Nearly all of his hair was ripped away, a tuft left clinging at the nape of his neck. George Custer, oddly, lay on his back, with hands folded on his abdomen, a posture those who knew him said was familiar, as if he had simply fallen asleep. He bore 2 fatal wounds, one in the temple and one near his heart, yet his body had not been mutilated like so many others. Boston Custer, the youngest brother, was found about 200 yards from the hill, stripped of clothing except for white cotton socks whose maker's labels had been removed. Across that field, names sewn into clothing were cut away, personal effects taken, and lives unrecognizable. The burial parties faced a task that no drill or training could have prepared them for. With half a dozen spades, a handful of axes, several picks, and improvised tools like knives and tin cups, soldiers scraped shallow graves into dry soil. They had to move quickly. The sun-baked bodies, flies swarmed, and scavengers waited. One trumpet of that grim detail, Giuseppe Martini, later described a ravine filled with corpses piled one upon another, a tableau so monstrous that witnesses struggled to describe it. Martini also found a first sergeant covered with torn pieces of paper money, $500 that had been entrusted to him for safekeeping, shredded and scattered across his broken form. Some of the mutilations were surgical in their horror, scalps hacked away, skin flaps still attached, heads broken open, bodies slashed and burned. Adjutant Cook's sideburns had been scalped, the skin hanging like a rope. Scout George Harrington reported 4 severed heads in the Sioux camp, trophies whose bodies could not be found. Lieutenant Charles Rowe of the 2nd Cavalry, described seeing a white man's head tied to a lariat, dragged through the village until the rope severed from the neck. Survivor Jacob Adams testified to the burning of captives, troopers tied to trees and set alight, actions witnessed helplessly by men of Benteen's division who were too far away to intervene. John Ryan, of the burial detail, recounted finding bones and fragments of blue cloth at places where men had been lashed to stakes. These stories, grim, contested, and raw, became part of the wider narrative of revenge and retribution that surrounded the battle. Only one of the guidons carried into Custer's charge survived. The small swallow-tailed flag was discovered pinned beneath the body of Corporal John Foley, who had tried to escape on horseback, but, pursued by warriors, shot himself rather than be captured. Sergeant Ferdinand Culbertson of the burial party found the blood-stained flag beneath Foley's corpse. That cloth, the Culbertson guidon, would become one of the most haunting artifacts of the day, a mute witness to the last desperate stand. Over a century later, it surfaced in an auction where, in 2010, it sold for $2.2 million, a sum that turned a piece of tattered fabric into a headline and revived the old controversies about memory, ownership, and commodification. Reno and Benteen are names forever entwined with the questions left by Little Bighorn. Major Marcus Reno led an initial attack that some described as brave and others as a collapse. He pushed into timber along the river, attacked a portion of the encampment, then withdrew, drawing fire and regrouping men in a defensive position. Critics accused him of cowardice or poor leadership. Defenders pointed to confusion, lack of support, and overwhelming numbers. Captain Frederick Benteen, meanwhile, had been sent with orders to scout and support. Orders which on that day were vague, interpreted differently by multiple officers. Benteen moved to assist Captain McDougal and later joined Reno's command, holding a skirmish line and enduring repeated sallies from warriors. He heard the distant gunfire on the ridge where Custer had gone forward, along with shouts and bursts of shooting, but nothing that told him clearly what was happening. Benteen's men later recounted the agony of hearing but not seeing, the knowledge that comrades were in desperate trouble, and the horror that they could do nothing to help. Survivors from Reno's retreat and Benteen's defense returned to the world changed. Many refused to speak of the dead, their silence loaded with the memory of what they had seen. Others wrote fevered accounts, maps, sketches, lists of names, trying to trap meaning into ink. The Army launched inquiries. Officers gave testimony, maps were drawn, and reputations were argued in public hearings. Newspapers swallowed each rumor and spat out new charges, that Custer was arrogant and reckless, that Reno had retreated, that Benteen had disobeyed orders. The truth proved slippery. Decisions made in seconds, misread commands, the thicket and the river, and the sheer scale of the enemy all combined to create a disaster whose culpability would be parsed for decades. Archaeology decades later delivered its own testimony. After wildfires plowed through prairie in the 1980s, researchers undertook painstaking surveys and digs that would rewrite how historians thought about the battlefield. Thousands of artifacts emerged from the soil. Cartridge cases clustered in patterns that gleamed like footprints on a map, showing where soldiers had made desperate stands. Buttons, belt buckles, and personal effects told of units and positions. Rifle stocks and barrels, some badly warped or cracked, suggested weapons jammed in frantic firing. Animal gnaw marks on bones testified to the scavengers that fed after men died. The artillery of evidence, literally casings and spent rounds, allowed scholars to reconstruct the choreography of the fight, where volleys erupted, where men formed last rings of defense, and where horses fell in tangled heaps. The earth, in that sense, had preserved a grim record the living could not. For Native communities, the story remained deeply human as well as political. Oral histories from Lakota and Cheyenne families emphasized the context. Decades of broken treaties, raids, and the relentless push of settlers into the Black Hills, a land central to their life and spirituality. Many veterans of these communities recounted that mutilations were not random cruelty, but ritual acts tied to revenge or spiritual beliefs about preventing enemies from returning. Elders spoke of rain in the face and other acts that stoked personal and tribal vengeance. That language of memory, shaped how many native descendants view Little Bighorn as a desperate assertion of survival as much as a battlefield victory. The conflict over memory extended into law and ethics. For years, relic hunters scavenged parts of the field. Artifacts became commodities, sold to collectors and museums. Gradually, laws and regulations emerged to protect both the site and the remains scattered there. Cemetery markers and stone monuments were placed, and in 1879, soldiers reinterred many of the bones in a communal grave on what became Last Stand Hill. White marble markers now dot the landscape, but their placement is often approximate. The identities beneath those stones are sometimes more hopeful than exact. Museums that displayed uniforms, weapons, and the culbertson guidon wrestled with questions of dignity and exploitation. Does a glass case honor the dead, or does it package suffering for spectacle? The relics themselves speak with stubborn clarity. A child's toy horse, wrapped in a green bill, a soldier's sock with its name torn out, a buckle beaten from a silver coin. These small things are louder than many speeches. They reveal intimate moments. What a man carried in his pocket, what a warrior prized, what a child clung to afterward. They are private artifacts that became public evidence. Archaeological sites where cartridge clusters formed a ring tell of final stands made by small groups, men refusing to retreat. Other clusters suggest panic, curved lines where cavorting bodies and horses collided. The bullets and buttons and bone fragments together map chaos back into narrative. And yet, the human dramas continued long after the graves were filled. Families in the East waited for letters that never came. Mothers and wives confronted the army. Veterans lived haunted lives. Some drank to deaden memory. Others spoke at reunions with voices that trembled. Native communities also carried the wounds. News of victory came with the knowledge that the reprisal would be severe. Within months and years, the U.S. government increased military pressure, treaty negotiations hardened into seizures, and bands of Lakota and Cheyenne who had tasted victory found themselves increasingly besieged. Time has not softened all the edges. Little Bighorn National Monument welcomes visitors who walk the ridges and read the stone markers, who pause where archaeologists point to bullet clusters and call them the last positions of men whose names we still know. Some descendants meet in uneasy reconciliation. Families of soldiers and descendants of warriors sometimes share space to remember differently. Others insist on separate remembrances, refusing to let one version of the past crowd out another. That friction is part of what keeps the site alive in American memory. It refuses to be simplified. The valley still whispers. When wind moves the grass across Last Stand Hill, it catches a listener's imagination. The artifacts that surface from the soil do not simply confirm events, they bring new questions. Why had Custer advanced as he did? What made Reno fall back when he did? Did Benteen follow orders or interpret them? Historians will argue for years to come, but what seems clear is this. The day's violence was total, intimate, and final. Men bled where they stood, and the prairie took them in. The dust has long since settled, but the lessons endure. Custer's last stand was not simply a military engagement. It was a collision of cultures, a brutal ledger of lives lost, and a mirror that still reflects the costs of conquest. The coins hammered into buckles, the guidon found beneath a corpse, the toy horse wrapped in dollar bills. These are the quiet witnesses that insist on being heard. Listen to them, and you hear not only the roar of battle, but the quieter, more human echoes of grief, revenge, and the uneasy pursuit of meaning in the aftermath of violence. Thank you for following this difficult story. If you found this journey compelling, I'd be honored if you subscribed and joined our growing community. Hit the like button to help more people uncover these hidden corners of history, share this video with anyone who craves forgotten truths, and leave a comment below. What do you think was the real turning point at Little Bighorn? Your voice keeps these conversations alive, and together, we keep the past from being forgotten.